Okay, good afternoon, to everybody. We're going to get started today, and I put on the whiteboard here. Hopefully, you can see this. We're going to talk about the fourth exam today, and it'll be available probably sometime tomorrow. I'm still putting the final touches on it. It's mostly done, but I'm going to put it together and post it. It'll probably be later in the day, to be honest with you. So you've got probably tomorrow night, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So you'll have until the end of Sunday to do that. Just to give you a bit of a brief reminder on the exam itself. Like all the exams, it's going to be this very same format as before. So I don't think there's a whole lot of explanation. It's going to be exam 4 is going to be timed at 90 minutes, and that's what we've had for the first 3 exams. There are going to be 40 multiple choice questions, and so you want to, you can obviously you can use whatever resources are available to you in order to do that. Keep in mind that you've got the time constraints, sort of be aware of that. And so when we talk about the chapters we're going to cover here, let me just sort of go over what we're talking about here so that we're familiar. There was a bit of a fragment from chapter 4 that we talked about, and dealing a bit with labor, and there aren't a whole lot of questions on this. So I think what is there is mostly straightforward, and I'll go over what that, I think is maybe 1, maybe 2 questions from that, and we'll talk about chapter 4. A little bit dealing with chapter 13, which mostly was covered in the last exam, but this is only going to cover types of goods. And I'll go over those once again, those types of goods, public goods, private goods, etc. Then we talked a bit, and there's a little bit of chapter 14, not very much. The labor piece is one that I didn't cover in great detail, just really sort of in the interest of time, but chapter 14 is covered. Also chapter 16, which deals with risk and insurance and information. Last topic, dealing with this sort of overall concept of market structure. And then chapter 19, which deals a little bit with international trade, okay? So, any questions about those and what those are about? So what I'm going to do is I've got just a little fragment of material that I'm going to talk about that we didn't get to on Monday. And it deals with this chapter 19, international organizations. I just want to cover this real briefly here. A lot of it's self-explanatory, and of course you can obviously read this for yourself in the text. But when we talk about international trade, we talk about the benefits of international trade, why it's important, what some of the upsides are to trade generally, and among those, there are benefits to both the demand and supply sides, as we mentioned. And there's my camera remote. So when we talk about international trade, what we're really getting at is why do we engage in it? What are some of the benefits, and more importantly, what are some of the hindrances to trade? I think one of the last things we talked about was this idea of trade restrictions, and I'll sort of mute the lights here a minute. And I'm not going to do too much on the PowerPoints today. The last of the PowerPoints went out on Monday, so you got all of those that you need. When we talk about nations imposing trade barriers, what we're talking about is usually it's a way for countries to sort of protect its domestic producers from the competitive impact of foreign producers who would want to send their goods into a country and compete against domestic producers. And sometimes they can do it at a lower cost, they can sell at a lower price, and so therefore make the domestic producers less competitive. And so as a result, sometimes firms or countries, I should say, it's really a governmental issue because it's taxes and restrictions. These are simply governmental actions. Sometimes at the behest of industries themselves. I know certainly the quotas I talked about on Monday in the auto industry that were imposed in the 1980s on Japanese-made automobiles were really at the behest of the auto industry that basically pressured the administration and Congress to say, look, we're getting killed here, we're going to lose lots of employment, Japanese manufacturers are taking lots of market share, and so can't we do something, at least in the short term, so that we can be competitive, make some quotas on those vehicles? And so they did, imposed quotas. And this sort of goes against a lot of what the United States preaches in terms of free trade, because we oftentimes preach free trade and we say that everyone should lower trade barriers, but occasionally we do have some of our own, and this was one of them. So as a result, those were up there. Now the Japanese manufacturers, as I mentioned on Monday, sort of got wise to the whole issue and decided to simply open plants in the United States, which was perfectly fine with Americans, I think, for the most part, because it employed lots of people. the goods are made here, and so all the factors of production that went into it remain domestic, and so as a result, there's one way around that that can happen. So it's one way that companies can sort of get around those restrictions. And here's the thing, though, I think there's been a feeling for a very long time that the benefits of free trade outweigh those of restrictions. And because restrictions themselves tend to stymie trade, they tend to reward inefficient producers, bloated producers, and probably the most famous of these laws was something called the Corn Laws in Britain, which were around for decades, and really restricted international foreign imports of grain products. They're called corn laws, but the term corn really applied to all grains. It was mostly wheat, actually. And the idea was to sort of protect landowners who were very wealthy and very powerful from imported grains from France and Spain, Portugal, other countries that could produce them at a lower price. And thereby shifting the supply to the right would bring the price down. Obviously, if something becomes less scarce, the price comes down. That's exactly what they didn't want. So sometimes these are sort of done at the behest of business themselves, even though the fact is, oftentimes pay the price of these particular things, of this protectionist legislation. That's really what this is protectionism. And so advocates of free trade argue against protectionism. And there's some international institutions that have been involved with trying to promote free trade in general. The one I'm going to focus mostly on here is the World Trade Organization. So it's an institutional body. It is now I say it's institutional, and what do I mean by that? I mean that it started out really as a series of international trade negotiations called the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, which had been going on since the end of World War II and for many decades afterwards. And they would meet in different places in the world. There was the Uruguay round that went on for year after year after year. And so finally, and it was really an effort to bring down trade restrictions worldwide so that goods, labor, financial capital, information, and technology could move across international boundaries without these sort of artificial governmental restrictions. And so the WTO now is the body that sort of inherited the effort. It has a formal framework now. It's based in Switzerland, which is obviously a neutral ground from a political standpoint. It's an unaligned country. And they promote free trade without restrictions. And sometimes they'll be asked to get involved in international trade disputes between countries. That is, if a country has a beef with another country over its trade policies, they may take it to the WTO. But the WTO doesn't really have the United States do this or Canada do this, but they can sort of mediate and say, this is the way we interpret this particular trade stricture. And so therefore, we think that it'd be better off to do without that. So, I mean, then they get involved periodically in sort of nation to nation, sort of bilateral kinds of questions about trade and sort of try to mediate disputes as they come up, okay? But there are a couple of other entities that we should talk about, just since we're talking about international economic ones. I'm not going to get too much into because you will go on, if you take money in banking, which is a 300-level econ course, and not everyone's going to take it, but if you major in finance or econ, certainly finance majors will take it. You probably will run across the World Bank, the IMF, and probably also something called the Bank for International Settlements, which is really the way that financial institutions can settle transactions and countries can settle transactions between them if they belong to this Bank for International Settlements. There's something called the SWIFT system, which I think the acronym stands for Society for Worldwide Bank Financial Transfers that countries belong to. I know Russia just got kicked out of it over concern over its invasion of Ukraine. And so they've been kind of complaining about that, saying we can't have access to these international financial. Basically, these two institutions here were set up after the end of World War II. And what the World Bank is basically there to provide project financing. And it's usually big capital projects for developing countries and oftentimes revolving around water, whether it's dams, waterworks. Obviously, dams are important for flood control, municipal water supplies, irrigation, and all that. So oftentimes they're involved in that particular project, those projects. And then the IMF is also an entity that's set up after World War II. They're both based in DC. The World Bank always has an American as tradition as its president. The IMF always has European as its president. There's no particular rule. I think it's more custom. So the US president names the head of the World Bank. And I remember there was a time when President Clinton had to give quick citizenship to a guy from Australia so that he could maintain the tradition of having the World Bank is headed by an American. So those are just the traditions. I don't think that those are a rule. And the IMF, basically, if there's a country currency issues. It's more of a macro question. If you take macro, or you have taken macro, you might get into that. That is this currency exchange between countries. Sometimes currencies themselves are a commodity that trade internationally, as you probably know if you've ever traveled. That is, you can buy pesos with dollars and yen with euros or whatever. And so sometimes though there's a run on a currency, and sometimes the IMF is sort of called on to try to support that particular currency, even through things like emergency loans and whatnot. And Greece was sort of one of the most recent recipients of IMF intervention. So you just want to know. And then the regional trade associations, the EU, which is the European Union, which is not the same as the Eurozone, which is the European currency zone, because not all countries, so a lot of countries belong to the EU but don't belong to the Eurozone. Britain was one of those that had its own currency but also belonged to the EU. Now they're sort of in the process, I think, still of sort of withdrawing from the EU. Another example would be a country like Norway, the Netherlands. They have their own currencies, so they're not part of the Eurozone, but they belong to the EU. It's a free trade zone. So they're basically like the United States of Europe. I don't mean that in a glib kind of way. I simply mean that the idea was sort of copied from the United States, where it's long been the case legally in the United States that states could not impose taxes on goods going across state lines. Because to do that would sort of violate principles of free trade nationally, but to do that. And then NAFTA stands for North American Free Trade Agreement, which has been around for almost 30 years now and has been controversial from the beginning. It was really an effort to sort of liberalize trade barriers between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And there have been other countries that have wanted to join, and even ones in Central America. So there's an expansion of that called CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. But the one that's most prominent and largest, obviously, is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in some ways, it's either lived up to your worst expectations or your best expectations, whatever your feelings were on the subject. I know that for a lot of people, the movement of manufacturing and labor to Mexico has been a concern. U.S. has lost lots of manufacturing jobs, particularly companies that are simply just located right across the border. In case we have these operations called Maquiladora, which are located in border towns like Juarez and Tijuana, and they're just right across the border. You have their American companies like General Electric and Raytheon. They're just doing business there, but they moved in order to take advantage of lower wages and lower regulatory costs. So that was not such a good thing from a labor perspective. I think a lot of people in the labor movement thought it was going to be bad, and I think probably some of their rationale for thinking that had probably been justified. But nonetheless, it has increased trade among the three countries. What it has not really done has not done what it promised to do. Primarily was the free movement of labor, which has been problematic. Obviously, that's south to north. And I know we in this country are always talking about south to north immigration into our country, but keep in mind too that Canada is also not real keen on south to north immigration into its country. And they made that very clear during the American sort of a very small effort of Americans to leave the U.S. During the Iraq War, when people were protesting that. Unlike during the Vietnam War, where it was no problem to go to Canada, the Canadians were a little less receptive to it. So it's sort of a bias that has resided. And this north-south divide has been going on around the world, and it's something that is probably for another day. It's a bigger subject. But my point has been controversial in some ways, and in some ways has not lived up to its potential. In some ways, it's lived up to exactly what people feared it would be, depending upon your point of view. And I think it really does depend on your point of view. I can tell you that probably has benefited from NAFTA, particularly since the peso got stabilized in terms of its value. And in fact, how they did that was essentially the peso was in a free fall point. And they just simply linked the value of the peso to the US dollar. And we talked about this in macro. I don't want to get into it too much here other than just to mention it. But I think probably it's the case that Mexico has benefited. Mexico, in a lot of ways, is really becoming a very much an industrial modern country. I mean, we know that there are lots of really extremely rural areas in Mexico, and obviously they've got trouble with drugs cartels and whatnot. But nonetheless, on balance, I think probably the NAFTA free trade agreement has probably benefited that country. Okay. Okay, so that sort of does it. That sort of wraps up. And these are posted in the PowerPoint package. I'll leave it up there just in case you want to see that. So I want to go on. I want to talk a bit about the fourth exam, which is coming up this week. Again, it'll be available sometime tomorrow. Once I get buttoned this up. If I get it done tonight, I'll post it, and it'll probably be tomorrow sometime. I try to make it available as soon as I can, but sometimes I don't know until we finish a class. If I have an exam that week, I sometimes don't know how far I'm going to get in the class sessions leading up to the exam. So I'm sort of reluctant to put it together until I know. But I pretty much know where we're going with it. So let's talk about the exam itself. First of all, let's talk a bit about this issue of labor and know what the causes of demand and supply shift in the labor market are due to. Know why those are happening. And we talked about those. We talked about things like the demand for certain skills. And so if there's a demand for certain skills, then that raises the demand. So for the last several years, there's been demand for people who've got lots of tech skills. So software coders and programmers and app developers, they've had no trouble finding jobs for the most part. High wage jobs, and that's an area that's been growing. Also, if there's a need for the particular output that is being demanded, then the input, which is labor, is also a function of that. So when we talk about the demand for labor, we're talking about derived demand. And the term derived is this idea that demand is derived, demand for that labor input is derived from the demand for the output itself. And so healthcare would be one great example of this, because obviously the demand for healthcare is rising for now, what is now a very long time. And it's probably not going to slow down anytime soon, given the fact that, the population is getting older. This is all independent of the whole COVID thing, which, actually was a double whammy for the output market, because we had an exodus of workers sort of leaving that labor field. And then we had, and the demand was rising for this. So those are two things that have forced some wages up. And I know I've seen article after article about starting salaries for nurses, or maybe not even starting salaries, but for experienced nurses and healthcare techs, what they're earning. And it's pretty encouraging. I know that there are people who have left their current occupation to go, study something in the healthcare field just because the demand is there. It's probably not going to be changing anytime soon. Okay, so know about that. Know also about the issue of marginal revenue product. And so we talked about this a bit, and there's not a whole lot. I didn't want to get a lot of questions surrounding labor, demand for labor, how we measure labor, because we just don't really have the time in this course to do it. I wish we did, but it's just sort of the way it is. And plus I had a little bit of where chapter 4 was located. I thought it came in a really strange place in the text. That's just my opinion. So I sort of rolled that back a bit, but given the fact that it's sort of backtracking, I didn't want to, we're not even going to cover, we didn't cover actually most of that chapter. So just read what we have covered in class for the most part. We also talked about, marginal revenue product. Let me go back to that, which is essentially equal to marginal revenue times marginal product. It's a way of wage determination, particularly in imperfectly competitive markets, where firms can assess what the value of the wage is. Now, it's very theoretical, and I'm not a labor economist, and so I know labor economists have struggled to try to say, look, it is theoretical, and it doesn't always apply across industries. Like, for instance, particularly in the service industry, how do you measure the productivity of somebody who works in the service industry that maybe is working in a call center? I mean, you could say, okay, a number of calls you receive. Well, they don't really control the number of calls they receive, and they don't really control the fact that they get somebody on the phone for 20 minutes who doesn't understand anything. They're trying to say that's not their fault. They can't handle that. Right? It happens. And so how do you, and I know I worked in the service industry for a lot of years. We struggled for years to try to determine productivity of service workers. It was just hard. So you have to realize that sometimes this idea of marginal revenue product is more theoretical, but it serves, though, as kind of a basis for how wages are determined. And that is, if there's an increase in the value of labor, productivity goes up, then the wage should follow. And that's one of the, somebody here, okay, I muted whoever was making noise there. Sorry about that. But, I apologize. It just makes it a little easier for the rest of us. It serves as a conceptual basis. Now, wage labor labor wages have not necessarily risen with productivity. It's a big issue. And you may study that if you do take a macro course, but it's excuse me, it's all sort of a macro picture, and dealing with inequality in general, which again, it's one of those topics that it would have been nice if we had more time to talk about, but we did not. So okay, let me see here. We also talked about I mentioned what can cause shifts in demand, shifts in supply. So know about those. Also, we talked about the minimum wage. Okay. And the minimum wage has been a topic that is essentially, it's a wage floor. In other words, minimum wage is set above the market wage so that workers can get a higher wage as opposed to what employers are paying them. And the theory, though, some economists believe that unemployment rises as a result of minimum wage laws. Now, other economists don't buy that, okay? But I bring it up because it is a big topic. I know that economists are periodically surveyed as to what they think about certain things, and this is one. I can't think of a topic that divides the econ profession more than any other as to whether or not minimum wage laws increase unemployment. Personally, I don't know that I buy it. That's just my own particular point of view, but I bring it up because it's such a controversial and really unresolved issue. It really is an unresolved issue because whenever minimum wages, and it's more at the local level, I think, than it is at state or federal levels, because whenever you see like Seattle raise its minimum wage, or Santa Fe or Albuquerque, which is well above the federal minimum on occasion, I think Seattle's like $15 per hour, something like that, and it's way above the federal minimum. That we always hear. What is it?
Florida too.
Is it Florida 15 an hour?
Yeah.
And I know there's been an effort to try to get $15 per hour across the country. I think it's probably not likely. I think there are places in the country where wages are a lot lower that firms simply, well, they'll probably find a way to cheat, and that's simply lower the number of workers, because you have to have X number of workers who qualify. But at the local level, you often hear about firms saying, well, I'm just going to lay workers off because I can't afford $15 an hour, or whatever the dollar figure is. And there's some anecdotal evidence for that. I think we heard a little bit of that in Santa Fe when Santa Fe imposed its wage above the minimum wage. But I don't know. I think it's an open question, and I think it's difficult to suggest that it happens simply because the evidence, is that we have a very low unemployment rate and wages are rising. So I don't know that you can really say that. But anyway, I bring it up because it's a tough issue. It comes up again and again and again. Those of us who live in the real world, where we have to deal with things like minimum wages and politicians who argue for or against minimum wage, it's something to be aware of what the debate is. However you feel about the debate, because it's still open, it's an open topic in econ. Okay, we talked about types of goods in chapter 13. So I know this was the very last bit that we did not get to for the third exam, and so I don't want to put anything on the exam that we didn't cover, but it's an important topic. And so when we talked about types of goods, there are two criteria which determine the type of good throughout the economy. And I sort of led that discussion off by saying, okay, up to this point in the class, we had pretty much talked about the only kinds of goods we really talked about were what we would call private goods. That is goods purchased and sold by private firms and private buyers. And the criteria that are used to determine if it's private good versus what other kind of good is called rivalry and excludability. Now, the two terms look like they might be the same thing, but they are actually quite different. Rivalry is the degree to which only one buyer can use a good at a given time. Okay? And sometimes only one buyer uses the good through the lifetime of the good. It never gets used again. It's something like an ice cream cone or something, a cup of coffee. But a house or an airplane seat would be reusable, but it's only usable at a given time. So a seat on an airplane is rival, but it's also excludable because you have to pay. Excludability refers to the ability to prevent non-payers from using the good. The ability to prevent non-payers from using the good. So there are goods that non-payers do use the good. And those non-payers who use goods are typically called free riders. And so you want to know what that term is. And I want to be clear here because I sort of emphasized in class that I thought it was important to emphasize that free riders should not be associated with freeloaders or disreputable conduct or anything. It's because a lot of us are free riders from time to time. If I call 911 and let's say I just moved to Albuquerque from from Chicago or wherever, and the day one I get here, I have to call 911. Well, I haven't paid for 911 here in Albuquerque, but no one's checking to see whether I paid or not. I'm still able to call them, so I am a free rider. And free ridership typically happens in what we call public goods. And these are goods that are non-rival, non-excludable. Those are goods that we can all use. The fact that I call 911 does not kick somebody else off the 911 line. But they're not excludable. They're not going to charge me for it. Okay. So private goods are those goods which are just the opposite. Those are rival and excludable. Public goods are non-rival, non-excludable. So we can all use the good at the same time. Okay. And then we have goods that are sort of intermediate between those. And the first of these is called common goods. Common goods are those goods which are rival but non-excludable. And we talked about things like, and they started out as being somewhat, and I mentioned this in the class at the time, they looked a little bit trivial, like picnic tables and library books and things like that, but they also have bigger, because they're own, common goods, the thing to know about common goods, sometimes called common resources, is that they're owned by really everybody, they're really owned by nobody. So who owns the fish in the middle of the North Atlantic? Nobody really, right? So whoever gets them, nobody really owns it, but then it's just a matter of you getting it. And if you catch a fish, that particular fish, then that's your fish, and you don't have to share it with anybody else. Okay, but that fish itself then it's a rival good, but it's not excludable. You didn't have to, and whatever cost that it is born is not the price of the good itself. So you just have to get out there and get the fish. And the same goes to the picnic table. Maybe you burn 50 cents in gas to get to the picnic, to the park, but that's not the price of the good. Okay. All right. So know about rivalry, excludability, and those kinds of goods. And there'll be some, and so you just want to be familiar with what those goods are. Okay. Okay. Let me see here. We talked about. Okay, there's a question dealing with productivity and wages, and this is more out of your book. I really like this question though, and there is considered to be a positive correlation between productivity and wages. And this is what the whole concept of marginal revenue product is. It's also the concept behind the value of marginal product of labor, which applies to competitive labor markets. And I know we didn't talk a lot about that, but I think you do want to hone in on the fact that there's a positive relationship, a correlation between productivity and wages. So this is why some people don't earn very high wages, is because they don't produce that much value. And it sounds like a really harsh statement. The reason you're underpaid or whatever is because you don't produce much value. But it's all relative to the value of the output that's being created. So, and that's essentially what's going on. So somebody like a doctor produces lots of value. So as a result, he or she is paid a large amount. So it really depends on the value of the labor. And it's really an economic issue. And I realize that not everything is measurable in economics. And so you can't say that a teacher doesn't produce value. But how do you put a dollar figure on it? It's hard to do. There are intangibles, but economics has got its limitations, and so we sometimes bump into limitations in our ability to measure what all these things of value are. Okay, so know about that issue about productivity. We also talked about information failures, and that was really the last topic that we got into with respect to what we call market failure. And by the way, and I think there's actually a question related to market failure. Just, you can scroll back to the definition. I posted all these PowerPoints. The definition is where the private sector, that is private actors, firms and households, cannot or will not allocate goods efficiently for society's benefit. And they do it because it's not really their job to do. I mean, it's kind of like expecting somebody to go around picking up trash. I mean, I just saw a sign the other day that I think it's here on university, where somebody's supposed to sponsor a bus stop. I thought, what a strange thing. First of all, what does it mean to sponsor a bus stop? What are you supposed to do with the bus stop? Pick up the trash? I mean, it's just a weird thing, I thought. And I had never seen that before. But it's something that it's typically not common, I can tell you that, because of the fact that there's really no responsibility on the part of any private actor to deal with some of the things that are more of society's benefits. And so we often involve government, okay? We involve government, particularly when the private sector can't do it. And knowing, of course, that there are cases in which non-governmental solutions can sometimes play a role. And those we talked a bit about as well, okay? We talked about this idea of two kinds of information failures. Imperfect information is one in which information is just simply incomplete, and it can be shared by one side or both sides or all sides of the transaction. And it simply results in the fact that people don't know what they don't know. And as a result of this, sometimes everybody doesn't know what they're talking about. And simply put, mistakes can be made simply because there's just incomplete information. There's just not enough to work with. That's a little bit less serious, I guess, than asymmetric information. Oftentimes is a result of a more insidious type of behavior where somebody knows they know something the other party doesn't. And so as a result, there's an information advantage. And they use that to their advantage in relation to the other party. And as I mentioned in class, something like I mentioned in my class, my dad would always buy new cars and always felt like he was always at a disadvantage because the car dealer knew exactly what their cost of the car was. And he kind of felt like they had more information than he did. And he was right, I'm sure. I think a lot of us have felt like that. We didn't really have all the information to make a good decision. And why asymmetric information has become such a big area in econ right now is because of the fact that economic products and goods and services are complicated than ever. I mean, they just really are. Like I went to the dentist this morning. I mentioned the class on Monday. I'd broken a tooth on a 3-day weekend, no less. But anyway, I broke a tooth, and so the doctor said, "Oh, like, oh, great." So, and she said, "And it's a tooth I can't do because I don't do teeth in the back." It's like, geez, it's like so. Now, what am I supposed to do? Say, well, I do it anyway. I mean, do I know that I need a root canal? And and she left the room. I asked her, "What exactly is a root canal?" I didn't really know. I mean, I've heard it before. It sounds pretty bad. I think I've had one before, but and she says when they pull the nerve out, I think it's like, oh, great, I've got that to look forward to. My point is, though, there are all kinds of products that we just simply don't know what we need. Am I supposed to say, "Oh, I don't need a root canal. Just do your best. It's fine. It's fine." I can, but I'm not going to get the best outcome as a result. I don't know. And if you just take a look at things like the financial world, how complicated it is. And I saw an article the other day about how a lot of the younger people graduating college are staying away from the stock market because they've seen the ups and downs, boom, bust, and they just say they don't want a part of it. And you really can't blame them so much for that. So, how do you know why the stock market went up 5% today and down 2% yesterday? Who knows? So that's why asymmetric information is so important, is because of this issue. And so oftentimes it leads to adverse outcomes. And when somebody makes a decision, and you want to know what there's a topic called adverse selection. When somebody makes a decision based upon incorrect information, whether it's imperfect or asymmetric, either one, it can be both, by the way. There's no exclusion. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Then we say they engage in adverse selection. And I know the term often, and it's not a coincidence that it comes up in the topic dealing with risk and also dealing with insurance, because insurance companies often use this term adverse selection, such as I sell $100,000 life insurance policy. I'm an insurance agent. I sell $100,000 life insurance policy to some life insurance policy to somebody, and they say, "I'm a smoker." "I'm not a smoker. I swear I'm not a smoker." And it turns out they are a smoker, right? And so I've insured somebody and I would have priced it differently had I known that person was a smoker. And sometimes they try to verify these kinds of things, and sometimes they don't. Last life insurance I bought, they came and drew blood just to make sure I was not a smoker or probably a drug user or whatever they're looking for. I don't know. They didn't tell me what they're looking for. They just said, "We need to draw blood." Okay, whatever. So they did. So it seems like an insurance term only, but it really applies across the economy whenever somebody makes a decision based upon information that's not really available to them or should be. Okay. So this chapter then deals, one of the overall topics is something called risk. To know what the definition of risk is, from not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's simply the degree of uncertainty about an expected outcome. If I have no idea what the outcome is going to be, then that's a pretty risky outcome. Okay. And if I think the odds are, it's just very uncertain, then that's very risky. If it's very certain, then it's not particularly risky. So I'm going to, after this class, I'm done for the day. So I'm going to get my car and turn it on. It's probably going to start. Let's hope. No, I mentioned it's probably not. But knock on wood, it's going to start. It's not particularly risky. I think it's going to start. So as a result, I'm expecting to probably go home, and so I should be home in 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. So I don't know that's a particularly risky thing, but something could happen, and so maybe I don't get there. So I'm not saying it's riskless, but it's not particularly risky, right? It's not particularly risky. So that's what risk really is. And so we also talked about the fact that economic actors, not just individuals, even though I know it's sort of tempting to always talk about individuals because it sort of makes for interesting stories about people who do risky stuff, but even business firms and other enterprises can engage in what's called risk seeking, and that risk seeking is that which is opposed to risk aversion. Risk aversion is the behavior that associates riskiness with loss. I don't want to do that; it's too risky, meaning I can lose, right? Not so much that I want to gain. Whereas risk seeking seeks out risk because it's associated with higher gain. And risk and return go hand in hand. And I think this is a common thing. And for those of you who will take a finance course in the future, which is probably a good number of you, you'll probably see how investment returns are correlated with risk. If you want to get a lot of return, you got to take a lot of risk, but you also might take a lot of loss too. So you have to be aware of that. If you want a riskless return on some investment, then maybe you're better off buying a CD in the bank or something like that, or savings bond or whatever. Which, by the way, is not a particularly bad thing right now because CD rates are paying more than what some stocks were yielding just a year ago. So it's not that, or even 6 months ago. So I don't think you're that. It's a pretty good situation right now. But that's what risk seeking versus risk aversion is. Okay. There are a couple of examples that we'll give in the exam about what those might look like. Okay. Okay. We also talked about this activity called risk management, and it's a business activity. Your text doesn't really get into it very much. Risk management, we said, is a business activity. It's oftentimes sort of segregated departmentally from other business units within a company because it's made of people who do things like try to mitigate losses from things like employee theft or customer theft or shrinkage. Shrinkage is simply the reduction in inventory due to things like damage. And things like leaks in roofs and people driving forklift skids through forklifts through devices and other things. That's all part of risk management, and insurance is one subset of that. So, and I know there's been I mentioned this in class that oftentimes I think people have this idea that risk management is sort of a subset of insurance, but really it's the other way around. Okay, insurance is one tool to try to mitigate risk. Okay. And we also talked about the difference between private insurance and social insurance. So note that social insurance, the intent is different than private insurance. Private insurers provide their product generally for a profit. And I say generally because there are some mutual companies out there that still want a big return, and they pay their executives well, their salesmen well. But excuse me, the company is really owned by the policyholders, but that trend is sort of reversing itself where these companies are becoming just regular stock companies like IBM, Microsoft, whatever, and they're out to maximize profit like everyone else. Okay. Okay. But social insurance differs because they're trying to achieve some sort of social end. Okay. So Social Security recipients get say retirement benefits to achieve an end. And the end is that people should have some sort of cushion in their older years, their retirement years, or when they're disabled. Okay. There are a couple of questions dealing with the two theories of regulation. One is called the public interest theory, and the other is called the capture theory. These were not covered in your book, so you can't find them there, but I did post some information on the PowerPoint slides. These basically are two. Regulation. Public interest sort of is what people maybe what the textbook example or even the intent of regulation is to protect the public from the abuses or temptations to do things they shouldn't do on the part usually of producers. Whereas the capture theory says that regulation is captured by these actors, and so as a result they control the very form of regulation itself. And so, in other words, regulation is captured by the regulated. And the regulators are oftentimes part of the regulated, and they sometimes have this revolving door, which many people have talked about as being a real conflict of interest. And we hear about that from time to time as somebody, and those who would argue against the criticism would say, well, who better to regulate the airline industry but somebody who knows about airlines? Well, that may be a good point. However, they're also very close to the industry and probably have some ownership in the industry, even if they don't buy or sell stock while they're in that position. They still have an interest, and those conflicts of interest are something that a lot of people have talked about in government, and it goes on. It's less common in our society now than what it used to be, but it still exists. Okay, so know about those two forms of regulation. We talked about trade. We talked about what some of the reasons for trade were and some of the benefits, both for the demand side and the supply side. Those are fairly straightforward. There's not really much technical of nature there. It's simply, sometimes the demand side is satisfied with what they've got domestically, but sometimes they want other goods that are not made domestically. Sometimes they're just simply, they're not made because they can't be made, so they've got to be imported. So I don't think we can grow a lot of sugar in the United States, and so it's pretty much imported. But yet we do a good job of producing and exporting tobacco, which most places in the world cannot grow tobacco. So we export a lot of tobacco and we import a lot of other things. And so there's a lot of cross-border trade. As I mentioned in class, there's that great quote from Paul Krugman at the beginning of that chapter 19 that talks about how trade's been around for centuries. And it's a very powerful thing. Particularly as a lot of his work dealt with how to lift up economies that were poor by having them engage in international trade. It does work. And there are examples of how it does work. Okay. We also talked about trade barriers, tariffs, and quotas. They're a little bit different what they are. Tariffs are taxes on imports. Quotas are limits on imports. As goods come in, there's a limitation on the number of those. So know what those are. I think there's a couple questions dealing with those. To know what the World Trade Organization is, there was a question about that. It's the sort of formalization of the of international trade rules internationally. Okay. Okay. Let me see here. Oh, and the World Bank. The World Bank you might want to know about as well. That's an entity that oftentimes engages to try to bring countries into the modern era. Okay. Okay, let's see here. Any questions so far about anything? I'm just trying to scroll down here and see what we've got. So there was a question I told you about free riders a minute ago. Oh, and to know what insurance is about, and know why countries or why companies purchase insurance in the first place. They purchase insurance, or anybody for that, I shouldn't say companies, it's anybody, in order to prevent against the risk of loss. To insure against the risk of loss. And then the price is paid is something called premiums. And I think that hopefully you can get that one without hopefully most of us know that the price paid is a premium. Okay. Okay, well, let me see here a minute. Okay. Also talked about this idea of risk pools, and that is one thing insurance companies do, private insurance companies, is they place people into risk pools. And so you might, and they do this all the time with all kinds of insurance. So for auto insurance, if you're 16 years old, you're going to pay a higher rate probably than somebody who's 21. And I mentioned this a couple of times. Insurance companies can do things in terms of discrimination based upon things that people can't do anything about, and that's the very definition of discrimination. And they're one of the few industries that can do it. So, like if you're married, you pay a lower car insurance premium than if you're unmarried. Why? And it's just a fact. And so, I mean, where else do you see that? I mean, where you pay? I mean, what they said, we're going to pay on this apartment if you're married than unmarried. I mean, I don't know that that's even legal to do, but insurance companies do that a lot. They differentiate and place people in pools and price the product as appropriate in their minds by things like marital status, age, smoking status versus non-smoking status, all these kinds of things. And so Those risk pools are where they move people around in order to price it. And it's pretty much all insurance, particularly at the individual level. This is complicated. I didn't get so much into that because sometimes there's a lot of other types of insurance. I mentioned some of them in class, but there are a lot of other kinds of insurance with that. It's really more for an insurance class if you take something like that. Okay. Let me see here. We talked about what some of the solutions to asymmetric information were. Some of those, one of those was something called the contract of adhesion. Write the entire contract. Legal liability usually falls to me as the writer of the contract because the other party just simply doesn't have any responsibility, didn't have any hand in creating the contract. We see this a lot in business to consumer transactions. And one of the things that I know people who have been active in consumer protection for a long time have argued is the fact that the paperwork just goes on and on and on in the transaction. And I mean, just when you buy a house, it's just they slide a piece of paper, sign this, sign this, sign this. And by the way, what if you were to say, hey, I haven't read that, I'm going to read it before I sign it? It would take you hours. It would take you hours, and you probably wouldn't understand a lot of that. And I'm just being real honest. And they would probably look at you like you're a troublemaker. I mean, they really would. But it's your right to do it. Really, it's your right to see it. I know when I bought my first house, all I asked the title company was that they faxed me the settlement statement, just a 2-page document. I just wanted to see where the numbers. Settlement statement, it's a government document called the HUD. One document, Housing and Urban Development, just says where all the money is going, where it's coming from. And it was like this, they were really put out that I wanted to see that. Like, why do I want that? You know? So just fax me the document. I just want a 2-page document. That's all before I go to closing. Now, what if I'd asked for all 400 pages? They probably wouldn't have done that. So that's a real problem. And I think consumer advocates have got a point when they say that people decide things, they don't really know what they're signing. And then they find out later that, oh, so I didn't know that. Well, you signed it. And oftentimes that's good enough. Are you going to, even if you go to court, it's like, is this your signature? Yes. Nothing further. That's the only. What are you going to do? And even buying, I know my wife and I bought a vehicle a couple of years ago, and I was amazed because I bought lots of cars, but the paperwork is just exploding. Even to buy a car, I mean, you know, and so did I read it all? No, I probably did not, but I feel like I had a pretty good understanding of more than the average person, just because I did do finance for a number of years, but still, I didn't, you know, there were a lot of things I didn't know. So it's a real problem. It's this imperfect information that is a real problem, and it's probably, as I mentioned in class when we first talked about it, the problem is getting worse, not better. Okay.
And what did you say it was called? Contract of
adhesion. Adhesion. Right. And there were other things in that category as well as to what to do. Things like plain English contracts and plain Spanish contracts. That's the idea that trying to make it readable to the average person with sort of an avoidance of the Latin terms that the legal profession is sort of fond of using, has for a long time. So, okay, let me see here. Are there questions for me about anything that I can go over? Because I think that is pretty much what you need to know for the exam. I didn't realize I was going to be done this early in the class. So I feel like I'm wrapping up a little earlier. Is there anything you want me to go over that you unclear about, particularly for this exam, and or anything at all?
like real quick, like stop NAFTA,
Right.
but it's pretty much like
NAFTA? Oh, you say Donald Trump stopped NAFTA?
yeah.
Well, I think he was okay. So President Trump was always, and this is something that's interesting because President Trump is even long before he was president, had lots of concerns over international trade generally, and I know he. Even as far back as I think the 80s, talked about the fact that he always felt like, particularly the Western countries that protected shipping lanes worldwide, were being taken advantage of by countries that took advantage of those protections. And oftentimes he would single out Japan because Japan has a very small military. And he said, why should we pay for safe passage through shipping lanes when Japan, so Japan can get oil? So, and I bring that scenario up, that it's a little vignette from those days. But it's something I think he really had felt strongly about. He was really had lots of skepticism about international trade. And I know he had a particular fixation on Mexico for some reason. I don't know what that's about. But I think it's, and frankly, a lot of his positions were sort of against his own party's sort of historical stance, particularly on trade. But NAFTA is still alive and going. There have been modifications. After 9/11, there were tighter controls on people moving around. I believe you have to have a passport now to go to Mexico and Canada, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah,
You do
but
have to
it's
have-
not called NAFTA anymore.
Well, it's been revised a number of times. But NAFTA was the original agreement that brought all this together. So, and it did a lot to try to take down trade barriers. But where it did not succeed was, or at least I guess, for those who really wanted a greater movement of labor, that really hasn't happened so much. And in fact, I know that a lot of people have had concerns about free movement of labor, and that's an old story. It's been going on for a long time. The idea that foreign persons are going to come in and take jobs from domestic workers. That's an age-old argument. Okay. Any other questions for me that I can answer? Okay, well, I'm going to be available. I'm here every day, and well, I'm not going to be here Friday, so I take that back. So here every day but Friday, and the weekend. But available by email, or you can call me if you like, and I'm really glad to help you. And then when we come back on Monday, we'll talk more. Let me, I've got something in the chat box. Let me make sure that I apply that here. It's going to be open on Thursday. The question was, when's the exam going to be open? Sometime tomorrow. Okay. As early as I can make it available, I will. Okay.
Is it you want Sunday?
Sunday night. Sunday night. Sunday 11:15. Okay. Well, everybody have a great rest of your weekend. I'll see you next time.